Hey guys, welcome to the lab portion of the Fundamentals of Strength and Conditioning. I'm Dr. Tim Pavlik. This is my brother, Dr. Mike. We co-own Physio, Orthopedics, and Performance in the Merrimack Valley, and we're then the senior lecturers on Fundamentals of Strength and Conditioning here at the University of Akron. This is our COVID 19 year 2020 edition of our lab. So not ideal, but we will cover the content that we need. And you guys will have access to us as your instructors too. We will have the lab document posted online, which you guys can watch this video and take notes on, and then this will be on YouTube with a closed captioning added and everything that's needed for that. So this is the deadlift, the basic principles of the deadlift. And it's pretty easy to go through and max out your deadlift and hit a good 1 rep and pick something heavy off the floor. It's challenging to deadlift for a lifetime without getting injured, and that's where we kind of come in. So our job and your job as students and future healthcare professionals, whether it's strength and conditioning, or physical therapy, or chiropractic, or coaching, or anything, is taking your athletes, looking at a movement pattern, and deciding what is good form versus bad form, and deciding what you need to modify in terms of that to keep them improving from a strength standpoint and also avoiding injury. So basic principle number 1 is a bracing sequence. Obviously with the deadlift, it's a posterior chain exercise, so your power is coming from your glutes, hamstrings, your posterior chain hip muscles, and that's where the explosive and the power is coming from, the strength building is coming from. But when it comes down to it, if you have a really, really powerful car and it's on sand and the surface is weak that you're generating that power off of, then you're going to lose torque, you're going to bleed force, you're going to have an injury that's happened to your low back, your hips, something along those lines. And so the bracing sequence is what's going to set this deadlift apart compared to watching a YouTube video outside of the educational component of this class, and just having your clients say, oh, I watched YouTube, I know how to deadlift now. This is what makes you guys different. So we will talk about the bracing sequence. It's full body bracing from your scapula area all the way down to glute and hamstring activation, taking the torque out of the bar. Number 2 is creating torque. And so creating torque is basically having every single joint in your body on lockdown to allow for your power and your strength to be maximized. If you have one joint that has laxity in it, then just like this barbell where you hear that clanging motion, the torque you take on your joints, take on the barbell before you move anything from a weight standpoint. Loading your hips and hamstrings and keeping your shins vertical kind of go together. So you'll have so many people at the good old University of Akron Rec Center who go to deadlift and they bend at the knees and they pick up, and that bending at the knees is not a hip hinge motion. This is a knee dominant movement, and a knee dominant movement is quad dominant. A hip hinge motion, in which your tibia and your shin should stay vertical, upright to the floor, is what's going to turn on that posterior chain and allow for that balance to come in a posterior chain, a hip hinge movement. If not, then you're basically squatting with the barbell in front of you if you're bending up and down at the knees and creating a knee dominant movement. And the last is distributing your weight through the center of your feet, so you're not falling forward, you're not falling backwards. And those are kind of the basic principles we'll cover here today. Bumping to the last page here, look at the, second page, looking at the detail section. It talks about grip and not listed here, but stance as well. So grip, you have 2 options. You either have a flip grip or a symmetrical grip. The symmetrical grip is what we're going to be using. That symmetrical grip is more translatory to other exercises such as the clean, the snatch, anything like that. So when you're teaching your client, obviously that pronated, supinated grip right here is more common inside the deadlift and maybe allows you to move heavier weight. But if we're trying to avoid asymmetries, then we're going to start with a double overhand grip. The second portion is called the hook grip that they talk about, and the hook grip is basically if you were holding the barbell and holding the knurling, you're wrapping your thumb around first and then squeezing on your fingers. A lot of people will use like wrist wraps to avoid losing your grip strength in terms of the deadlift and allow you to move heavier weight, have your grip not give out on you. The hook grip is another really functional way to do that, in which you are looped down through the thumb and then wrap around the fingers. It's not comfortable, but it is going to max out the way you can move from a grip standpoint. And those are 2 of the details that are there. You will see as athletes kind of move up in terms of the deadlift, and if you're trying to be competitive and not just teaching for lifestyle, for functional movement purposes, but for competition purposes, a lot of these rules don't apply, and you'll see a flip grip, usually supinated, pronated grip, and probably using the hook grip as well, more common in Olympic lifting. But things that are kind of details, but need to be aware of moving forward, because you'll see a lot of that inside of competition. And so obviously the deadlift is a very functional movement. Anybody who lives their life is going to be doing some sort of picking off the floor. So this does translate outside of athletics and into an everyday population. Not everyone who watches this video is going to be working with high-level athletes like we have the privilege of doing, But at the same time, that posterior chain dominance is very specific to anybody inside of life who needs to have the strength to pick something off the floor, or really to generate power to run, to sprint, to move your body forward, to walk up a hill. It's all posterior chain dominant movements. So it definitely translates across the board. So the first thing you want to do inside of the deadlift when you're instructing someone how to deadlift and you're looking at performance enhancement is kind of talking through whether they have the motion to deadlift. And this is important because there's two different types of setups we cover here. There's a top-down setup and a knees forward setup covered in both pages. The top-down setup is for people who have good hamstring length. If you're looking at the main limiter inside of the deadlift from a range of motion standpoint, it's going to be posterior chain length. Where they attempt that hip hinge, they run out of space, so they have to cheat a little bit. And the cheating is okay if you're someone who doesn't have the posterior chain range of motion to go through and do that movement pattern. But the cheating is not good when you're looking at avoiding injuries, you know? And so really it's cheating to some degree, but being able to back off that cheating, that range of motion issue, and it's establishing the best positions that you can. And so there are two tests that should be done beforehand from a range of motion standpoint and a screening standpoint. And the first one is the straight leg deadlift test. So I'm gonna have Dr. Mike walk up to the barbell, and he's in his stance. With your stance is like your jumping stance. And I know that everybody watching this video can dunk a basketball, and if you're about to dunk a basketball, which we might do all the time at a high frequency at 5'11" and 6'1", obviously.
11 3/4.
5'11" 3/4, you know. That powerful stance where you're probably a little bit inside of shoulder width is your deadlift stance. His feet are being cut across, bisected that barbell, drop down, it would cut his toes off and his midfoot off. And all he's gonna do is he's gonna take a little bend of the knees, and he's going to, without moving at the ankle and without rounding your shoulders, so his shoulders are pinched down and back, he's going to hip hinge forward and lean forward directly, and we're gonna see where his knuckles end at the barbell. So you're gonna hip hinge forward here, and you can see that Mike's motion is pretty decent. You want the barbell getting to around the mid hand or the end of the fingers, with his shoulder blades pinch and his shins upright. So go ahead and round the shoulder blades. So if he rounds the shoulder blades, his motion is dramatic, but this is not a healthy position, so he should be retracted. And this is just for testing purpose to decide what kind of setup you should do. So based upon this, it looks like Mike has good hamstring range of motion. Test number 2 is a long sitting test. He will go right here in front of the barbell. His ankles and toes will be dorsiflexed towards him. His feet will be straight, and his goal is to sit up as high as possible. And then you should be asking your client, is this comfortable for you? And if Mike says it's comfortable for him, and there's not any irritation to the low back or into the hamstring area, then we can say that this test, and you can see his body's upright, we're at 90 degrees of the hip. These guys' knees are pretty much flat on the ground. Then we can say, okay, we have 2 nuts now saying that he has adequate posterior chain range of motion. And you will start with this first set of technique that we'll talk about with the deadlift. I will say from a performance enhancement standpoint, it's kind of cool, like we modified a guy's setup maybe 2 semesters ago in my class, and his deadlift went from like 630 to like 640, and a 10-pound PR when you're already going through and deadlifting over 600 pounds is pretty awesome. So that's where this is performance enhancing and not just injury prevention. So we are assuming that Dr. Mike has good hamstring range of motion, which he does compared to myself, and maybe I'll demo the second part. But the key here is now going through the bracing sequence, and this is laying the foundation to use those powerful hip muscles and not bleed torque, bleed power, and lose force. So Mike is going to step up, and he is in his powerful basketball dunking stance that he was doing earlier today. His toes are pointed forward, his feet are shoulder width apart, a little bit inside of shoulder width apart, and that bar will be dropping down and bisecting and kind of cutting his feet in half if it dropped down to the ground from a bar standpoint. So bracing his full body. The order does matter, and the biggest portion is putting your low back and your hips in neutral. So if you look, Mike has a little bit of sway back through here. We talk about this in the biomechanics lab. So the first thing Mike's going to do is put his hips in neutral, and that is done through a glute squeeze. So squeeze the glutes, and you see his hips naturally kind of shift a little bit forward and have a little bit posterior pelvic tilt, and that is the neutral position for him. When he's in that neutral position, squeeze the glutes, now try and bend forward. You can't. Yeah, you can't bend forward unless you relax your glute squeeze. So the glute squeeze is not the bracing sequence that's going on the whole time, it's just putting you in neutral. So you always brace first by the glute squeeze, and then he takes a deep breath in, and he exhales, and he gets tight right here and tight to the outside. So he's tight through the rectus, tight through the oblique muscles. And at that point, his glutes put him in neutral. He had this deep belly breath in, and now he's held in neutral. And you should be able to breathe the whole time. It should just be restriction all through here. I will say the bracing that's going on here should be equivalent to the percent that you are deadlifting. If you're deadlifting a 1 rep max 100%, then you are braced 100%. If you're doing 3 sets of 10 at 75% for hypertrophy, then you're braced at 75%. If you brace 100% and try and do 10, you'll fail, you'll lose your brace, and it'll be really good for 1 rep, but you can't hold that for a long duration. Just walking around, I should be glute squeeze, brace through here at like 20% all day long. That should be happening. And it's really motor learning that allows it to happen. So go back to this glute squeeze. He takes a deep breath in, he exhales, tighten to rectus, tighten to oblique. The next thing he's doing is he's pinching his shoulder blades back and down. So at this point, he's now braced here, he's braced here, he's braced all this mid-scapular area. The last thing he's doing is if there's a piece of paper under both his feet, he would try and tear the paper in half. So relax. So from a muscle standpoint, what's turning on is the glute squeeze is putting you in neutral, rectus and oblique are holding you in neutral, the glute squeeze is relaxed, you can go through a functional movement pattern of bending forward. He's now pinching his shoulder blades down and back, which means your upper extremity braced, your core is braced. And then the last part is when he's pushing out, the muscle that's turning on is that glute med muscle, those abductors that give you stability and prevent your knees from collapsing when you're deadlifting or squatting. So that is the last portion he's doing, and at that point he's full body brace, and then we can move on to the actual hip hinge movement. So the next part that we're going to do is actually get in position and take the slack out of the bar. We've taken all the slack out of his system from a musculoskeletal standpoint and braced all the joints, and now we want to take the slack out of the bar before we pull. So Mike's going to go through his bracing sequence. He's going to do a glute squeeze. He's going to inhale. He's going to exhale. He's tight here. He's tight here. The glute squeeze can now relax, so he's now functionally in a good solid position and then held in from a core standpoint. He's pinching his shoulder blades down and back. You see that scapular retraction and those shoulders kind of set at neutral, and then all tension should be out of the trap. It should be nice and supple tissue through here and not like contracted or anything because that mid back is activating. He is externally rotating, which is knees out, and there's a little bit of bend at the knees. And what he's going to do is without his tibias shifting forward, without dorsiflexion and moving at the ankles, he's going to hinge forward. He's going to wrap one hand around the bar, the other hand around the bar, and at this point he's going to lean back a little bit and he's going to take the slack out of the bar. And at that point, you can relax, but you hear that click happen, you can relax, Mike. And at that point, he is basically going through and the slack is out of the musculoskeletal system, the slack is out of the bar, and that is like as close as you can get to moving weight without moving weight. It's definitely like the slack is out of the bar, the slack, you hear that little click of motion. When I worked up to the bar, go through that position again. And when he takes the slack out of the bar, there's no noise. And I get a little bit, you saw that bar kind of rise up the ground. So that is as close as you can get to deadlifting without actually deadlifting. A big thing to see is the whole body's in neutral. So you see a lot of people deadlift and do the extension motion at your neck. So you'll see this all the time. People think they need to see where they're going. That only applies to driving a car, not with deadlifting. That's going to change on you from an environment standpoint, hopefully. And so he is losing force into the cervical spine with that motion. So he should be in neutral. He'll be seeing straight forward at some point, but it's not till the end of the deadlift. So kind of bringing everything together and going through that hip hinge motion. He goes through his bracing sequence. So he hits a glute squeeze to neutral. He inhales and exhales, and he's tight here and tight here. Glute squeeze is relaxed. His shoulder blades are pinched down and back, and he's external rotated his hips. Everything's maxed out in the chain. He then has a little bend in his knees, and he hinges forward. He's keeping his neck in neutral. He sits his hips back a little bit, and you hear that clink come out of the bar. And then he stands up where his hips and knees are moving all at the same time. At the top, he hits a glute squeeze. There's no leaning back. There's no looking to the sky. There's nothing like that. That would be a fail on the practical portion of it where you are observing someone. And that's kind of the end of the traditional deadlift in this phase.